Tea, coffee, biscuits.
Should I close the door?
Yeah. I think we'll leave, maybe leave it open because I think people are still.
Okay, thank you all for coming. We are about to kick off an event organised by the School of Law and the Centre for Sociological and Criminological Research at Middlesex University. This event is called Black Lives Matter, Race and Racism in the US. My name is Brad Blitz. I'm Deputy Dean in the School of Law. I'm Professor of International Politics. I'll be chairing this event. We're very fortunate that we have in St. Louis, Missouri, at Webster University, we have Professor Remy who is joining us through Skype, fortunately. To my left, we have Dr. Erin Sanders, who is a sociologist here, and Dr. Erin Winter, who is a sociologist at the University of East London. We have a colleague from upstairs. We've got Dr. Daguerre from the business school, who works on issues of welfare. Many of us see her as a social policy person, even though she is 2 floors above us. And we've got our Dean, Joshua Castellino. I'm going to start by asking if we can bring in Remy, who can hopefully provide a bit of context about not only what is happening in Ferguson, Missouri, which, as I understand, is really just a couple of miles from Webster University, but if you can provide a bit more of the context around this recent crisis in race relations in the United States, not simply in Ferguson.
Sure. I can kind of put it into a little bit of a context in terms of both how wider America has seen this. That's wider, W-I-D-E-R, not whiter America, which is something entirely different. But also where this came out of in the St. Louis context with Ferguson, and how it's similar to some of the things we're seeing in other sort of Midwestern and Northeastern cities like New York and Cleveland. And as somebody, I should preface this by saying I'm not a native St. Louisan, but I did grow up in the Midwestern United States, in Northern Ohio and Cleveland, actually. And one of the long-term legacies of sort of the civil rights movement in the United States is that many of the northern states never really had to face up with their legacy of prejudice and discrimination, whereas the Civil Rights Acts and the various other laws that were passed in the Justice Department here in the United States fell most heavily on the southern United States. And as a result of that, there's been sort of a long-term legacy of much greater segregation and discrimination in a lot of these cities that has simmered under the surface for the past 50 or so years, and occasionally erupts in some incidents, but it has never really been addressed in any sort of systematic or global sense. And so when the Michael Brown shooting occurred here, I think the initial sense was that this was going to be something that would very quickly pass, as had prior incidents of shootings of young African-American men by US police officers. And what was sort of striking here was the sense, particularly in the early days, immediately after the shooting, on the part of a lot of people, both white and black here in St. Louis, that we needed to just move on and forget about this, and this was not something that was, first of all, notable, and second of all, that really merited further discussion. And what became apparent as the process played out, as there was continuing protest, which I understand that one of the things that's going to be discussed today is the difference in media coverage. The US media has very much sort of focused on protests occurring only at a handful of points during the initial period after the shooting, the first week of October, and then in the wake of the grand jury decision, where I can tell you, as somebody that's been on the ground here, protests have been ongoing every day since that shooting, but that's not been the primary narrative. And so this has sort of been a long time building, and adding on to it are the shootings of people like Tamir Rice and the killing of Eric Garner, continued to fuel this sort of discussion and kept it in the news and kept it a live issue. And that, along, particularly here in the St. Louis area, with the way that the case was handled by the county prosecutor, really did create a situation where it's opened opportunities for sort of wider discussion on issues of race in the United States and issues of policing and how these intersect.
Thank you. And can you tell us what is the situation today?
Tense. There's still a lot of people calling for continued protest. I haven't actually been up there this week, but I was up in the Ferguson area last week. There is still daily protests going on. There are a number of groups, even if the national spotlight has moved away somewhat, there's a number of local groups that continue to push for more satisfactory responses on the part of the city, the county, and the state, as well as federal officials. There is the Ferguson Commission, which was chartered by the governor, which has come under quite a bit of criticism since it began its initial meetings. And those meetings have been very contentious, but I can tell you where I live, which is in the southern part of the city of St. Louis, where I actually live in the Shaw neighborhood, which was the site of another officer-involved shooting of a young man named Daguerre Myers. Most of my neighbors, and I'd say most of the white St. Louisans, have expressed a desire to move on and let this go, which is disturbing in the sense that they often do not want to have wider issues. It's been everyone has suffered. Let's just agree to disagree and move on and forget about this, which I think in a lot of ways continues to fuel the grievances of the African American community here in St. Louis and of the activist community, which would really like to see some more meaningful reform come out of this.
Thank you. I think certainly many of us here, our colleagues who work in the area of criminology, understand the implications of segregation, but the fact that you have polarized societies where you have effectively this racial division, where you have, as you're suggesting, and I heard a radio report affirming this, that you have effectively large sections of the white community saying, okay, this is an event of the past, suggests a lack of sensitivity to the experiences of the African American community and how they are understanding these events, these shootings, and the broader question in terms of governance and the role of policing in these areas, and that this is something of national proportions. It's not simply an event which can be located in the Midwest. On that, I'd like to bring in Dr. Erin Sanders, who's a senior lecturer here in sociology. She's the co-director of the Center for Sociological and Criminological Research. She's also American. She's also a feminist. She's worked on issues related to sex work, domestic violence, child sexual exploitation. And it is really thanks to Erin that we have this meeting, this event that was convened today. So I'd like to call upon Erin for her own presentation and comment on this. That's fine. We can simply disconnect you for a moment. I'm going to keep the audio plugged in so that you can feed in. However, I'm going to disconnect the video link. Now I'm going to step out of the way. Can you still hear us? Okay, but we can't hear you. Excuse me, let me find a cable to plug in again. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So as Brad said, I mean, really the kind of motivation for putting this event on was kind of a personal reaction to events that happened. I was home recently for Thanksgiving in the US at the end of November. when the non-indictment of Darren Wilson came through, and there was protests that were sparked in cities close to me, Baltimore and Washington, and at the University of Maryland, very close to the house where I'm from. And what really surprised me was, having been in the UK during the protests over the summer, the nature of the reporting, particularly at the local level, with how the case was being understood and how the protests and the riots were being represented by local media where I'm from, but more widely by more kind of conservative media, Fox News in particular. So I wanted to locate this incident and actually to suggest that it's atemporal to a certain extent, that this kind of thing has happened over and over again for the last 150 years in different ways, and that what we're seeing now is actually something that we've seen many times before in different ways. So this is a picture from the Human Zoo, which showcased at the Bronx Zoo at the turn of the century. So the presentation of black bodies as part of an ethnographic display, as something to be consumed. Hugely problematic. I think that could definitely not happen in this day and age, except I don't know if any of you happen to see Exhibit B at the Barbican, where the exact same thing happened. This happened over the summer. There were lots of protests around Exhibit B. This is in London. It was some would argue, a particularly uncritical approach to trying to understand the atrocities of colonialism, but done in a way that replicated it almost exactly. There was very little kind of critical engagement around how the presentation and representation of black bodies as objects for consumption might be problematic in particular ways. It was eventually closed down, which I think is at least some kind of recognition that this is problematic, but this continues today. So really what I want to talk about is how black men in particular have been positioned by the media in the US in particular ways. And I use particular literatures, kind of theoretical literatures to help situate this. So the idea that ethnographic exhibits help facilitate a particular gaze, that we have been invited as white people to look at black bodies in particular ways, that they're positioned and fixed in particular zones, in particular spaces for a kind of visual consumption. And this gaze is problematic. The way that we look, the way that processes of looking are enacted are political, and they're problematic. So this idea that the people who can look are the people who have power. You're able to look, you're able to fix the kind of the abject other into place in particular ways. So this is the idea of the gaze has really emerged from psychoanalysis, and feminists have done a lot of work on the gaze, but actually I think we can extend this to think about ways in which black bodies are presented for visual consumption and the problematics of this. So if we look at Kaplan in particular, she's a psychoanalyst. She writes about kind of film, she writes about imperialism and the gaze. And she draws on both Dubois and Fanon here, who are two really important kinds of Fanon is from the French Antilles and Dubois is African-American. The idea that looking for the black man in particular is problematic, that Fanon recognizes the gaze as particularly problematic. Mama, see the Negro, I'm frightened. This is the entire premise for his book, the idea that looking has put him in a particular position that's problematized for him. Equally, Dubois, the idea that looking somehow castigates, somehow marginalizes the black man. So the gaze marks and positions the other in place, and it creates a kind of a sense of objection. So what I was particularly struck by when I was at home in the US was the surveillance video running around, and the question about whether or not he was a criminal, whether or not he stole cigars from a corner shop, basically. As if this was a justification for the shooting of an unarmed black teenager in the streets of Ferguson. This video was played over and over and over again to reinforce the idea that this is the black criminal. Look what he did, he's a black criminal. This idea was reinscribed over and over and over again by Fox Media, by Fox News. The idea that the criminal black man was somehow justified to kill him because of his criminality, because of his blackness. Equally, what I was amazed by when I was at home was the way the non-indictment was presented. There was so little discussion about the fact that this white police officer hadn't been indicted. All of the focus was on why are the black communities protesting, why are they rioting, why are they burning down their own communities. This was more important than the fact that Darren Wilson wasn't indicted for killing an unarmed black teenager. And again, it was the kind of the representation of the black other that was used over and over again by mainstream media, particularly conservative media. I was really distressed this week to find out that there's a hashtag called #ChimpOut, which basically is used by racist media, social media sources, in racist social media sources, to talk about black people who act like animals. And there is this idea that certainly is purported. If you've seen the footage of the white police officer in Ferguson who says, "Bring it on, you fucking animals," this tend to kind of animalize, to exoticize, to negate the kind of the outrage and the sense of anger by reducing it to a kind of an animalistic response. And this is what I was struck by looking at the US coverage, is that the anger doesn't seem to be legitimate. It's positioned as so problematic that these are bad citizens, that Michael Brown was a bad citizen. He didn't enact his kind of American duty by enacting a sort of a decent citizenship. And this kind of this tendency to create the black other as uncivilized. And I think this, is definitely a kind of a moment for self-reflection. Certainly I do kind of critical whiteness studies, looking at how whiteness is constructed. So when we think about race, we're not just thinking about the other, we're actually thinking about how power dynamics work. But this idea that blackness, particularly I think in an American context, is situated as other and as inferior, and that there is a particular race problem that needs to be acknowledged. So, as Remy was saying, in the white community, there's a kind of sense, well, we just disagree about it, let's just forget about it. But we can't just forget about it. We can't just put it to the side and say, okay, well, we've got a race problem, let's just move on. We actually have to problematize this event and kind of keep it on the agenda. And I think it's also important that the gaze isn't just about kind of situating and positioning the black other. It's also intensely capitalist, class, and it's heteropatriarchal. So I don't know if you can read this: rich people paying rich people to tell middle class people to blame poor people. The idea that the news media, particularly Fox News in the US, but other kinds of conservative media outlets, reinforce this message. And I think for me that there's recognition that this isn't the only place that people get their news from. There's a kind of return of the gaze to a certain extent. So if we think about the way social media has been used, the hashtag Black Lives Matter is incredibly important right now in making this kind of relevant and bringing this, this alternative idea to the fore. That we don't just have Fox News telling us, this kind of uncivilizing discourse is the only way that we can understand this. There are other ways to understand it. So it actually kind of gives a voice, and it gives a kind of the chance of an oppositional gaze. So really it's just trying to suggest that we need to be critical about the way, particularly in the US, that particular media sources have framed this, and recognize that the way they frame it helps reinforce these really problematic ideas about the other that I think really come to the forefront in US politics.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you very much, Erin. I'd now like to turn to Dr. Erin Winter, who is a senior lecturer in criminology and criminal justice at the University of East London. Erin works on right-wing extremism, racist violence, institutional racism, and he's produced a number of studies on discourses and practices of terrorism as well. And you're going to speak to us about your interpretation of the events.
All right. So this is a sort of work in progress, so I'm going to have to refer to my notes. Also trying to keep to the time, so it's a bit tightly wound. With the election of Obama in 2008, discussion focused on the legacy of civil rights and the possibility of a post-racial America. Images of Obama were often juxtaposed with images of Klansmen, burning crosses, police using dogs and water hoses against civil rights activists and African Americans who had crossed the color line. Much commentary focused on the importance and the important issue of continuing racial inequality. And that was sort of to challenge the post-racial thesis. And that is quite important, but what was overlooked was the continuing significance of traditional forms of racism and racist violence. Often if the latter is evoked, if that sort of organized racism or racist violence is evoked, it's usually to distract from the more systemic institutional forms of inequality and racism. The deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, at the hands of vigilantes and police, as well as the media responses and significantly the criminal justice response, kind of put pay to the lie of post-race America. It also highlighted the issue of violence. What I'm quite interested in is the connection between systemic institutional forms of racism and organized racism and racist violence. So I'm going to speak to that about them today. On the eve of Obama's election, the former mayor of New York City, Rudolph Giuliani said, "We've achieved history tonight, and we've moved beyond the whole idea of race and racial separation and unfairness." This is in stark contrast to his statements a couple of weeks ago in exchange with Michael Eric Dyson, who he challenged, saying, "What about the poor black child that was killed by another black child? Why aren't you protesting that? Why don't you cut it down so many white officers don't have to be in black areas? White police officers wouldn't be there if you weren't killing each other." Now, there were other responses. It was rare they were so explicit. Some made it about the individual or a suspicious pattern of individuals. The NAACP lists 99 killed since 1999. But Brown was allegedly misbehaving, and Garner was obese and didn't care enough about his health to avoid contact with the police. Others blame the response. Rush Limbaugh claimed that protest and claiming racism are the problem. "I think there is a lot of grievance politics in this country. It's tearing the country apart. But," and I'm sort of kind of mind reading here, what he didn't say, "because racism is over and the only ones going on about it are the protesters and the Kenyan president who hate America and want to destroy it by blaming it for racism." Others reverse the racism. Racism is over and now everything is equal. Or, more frequently, whites, and particularly the police, who are identified with being white, or on the side of whiteness, are the disadvantaged group. On Fox, former New York Judge Jeanine Pirro argued minorities need training to be more sensitive to the police, their culture, etc. What was clear from Giuliani and Pirro is that both presume that white Americans are on the side of and identify with the police, and the police defend them, their practices and the law, and that black people are on the side of crime and criminality. And the only time that the police are helping them is when they're killing each other, but clearly don't want the help. And I'm reading into this discourse, sort of under the surface. Now, demonstrating that beneath the surface of post-race America, there were a lot of racist structures, attitudes, and assumptions from these quotes. Tim Wise argues that Obama's election did not signify the death of institutional racism, but it introduced a new form of racism, racism 2.0. Denial, displacement through enlightened exceptionalism that celebrates the achievements of individuals, but only because they are seen as different from the less appealing, even pathological black rule, which remained from racism 1.0, what he calls the old-fashioned bigotry that has long marked the nation's history, the kind that, in the most extreme moments, has precipitated racist murder, lynching, terror, and hate groups. So what was Giuliani thinking? Maybe he slipped up and finally revealed the racism that underlay his policing sort of strategies. Or maybe he had got frustrated because he had done so much to discipline and civilize the black population of New York. As it was Giuliani who ran for mayor as a crime fighter, playing on racism and racist fears in his campaigns in 1989 in the wake of the Central Park Wilding rape and Yusef Hawkins case, and in 1993, where he subtly implied that David Dinkins could not deal with the black problem as a black man. Of course, he wasn't as explicit about it as that. His law and order agenda, broken windows, and zero tolerance strategies, as well as stop and frisk, which he endorsed, targeted or disproportionately affected African Americans. They are seen by Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Davis, and others as being responsible for the deaths of Amadou Diallo and Garner. They also represent the deeply rooted structural, systemic, institutional racism that post-race ignores and conceals. But that which allows post-race to be accepted, as these kind of policies are constructed as being about crime and not race, which is also part of the post-race thesis. It's always about something else. And to claim it's racism is itself the problem. It's racializing. But the connection is obviously well established in history. Slave patrols, racist laws from slavery rights to Jim Crow segregation and their enforcement, lynching and other forms of extrajudicial punishment, incarceration from the sort of post-emancipation slavery through the back door of vagrancy laws, through differential sentencing and mass incarceration, disproportionate use of the death penalty, the war on drugs, differential sentencing for crack cocaine and powder cocaine, broken windows, racial profiling, etc. There's also been the framing of the situations, and I think this is what underlies it historically, no matter what the practice or the law changes, based on the assumption of the black threat and black guilt, and the police as vulnerable, ironically required to protect white vulnerability, which again places the police in the position of whiteness, but also vulnerable because of their whiteness. This clearly ignores the power, white supremacy, and the police being armed. This dynamic is evident in the video and commentary on Eric Garner, whose asthma attack was perceived as a threat, or famously Judith Butler's analysis of how Rodney King's struggle when pinned down by many police was seen as endangering them. This was also part of the prosecution, or defense, sorry, of the police. Michelle Alexander, Cornell West, and Angela Davis, and Kimberly Crenshaw have all commented on this history. And when you look back at this history, back to slavery, you don't see a distinction between pre and post-race, or between pre-post-race and post-race. The legacy goes back to slavery. According to Davis, there's an unbroken line of police violence in the U.S. that takes us all the way back to the days of slavery, the aftermath of slavery, and the development of the Ku Klux Klan, who have their roots in slave patrols, which she then links to George Zimmerman and vigilantism. While many will make clear the distinction between extremist racism and institutional racism, with the latter viewed as more embedded, powerful, effective, difficult to expose and defeat, and thus closer to socioeconomic inequality or discrimination in employment, housing, education. There is a whole historical overlap, and I think it's just important to note as I'm finishing up, between not only racist laws and law enforcement, but between the far right, those so-called right-wing extremists that we see now. And it's important that because while, for example, the Klan and the police were always on the same side. They were both defending racist laws. They were both defending Jim Crow segregation. Although they are widely derided as extremists today, that was largely a political and legal exorcism that followed civil rights. The House Un-American Activity hearings in 65 to 67, which declared the Klan criminal, terrorist, and un-American, basically exorcised that kind of violent racism from the body politic. They were no longer, that was where that kind of racism, that kind of extremism and violence resided. It was not in the police with their firehouses or their dogs, or the ones standing side by side with the Klan, or actually being members of the Klan. And that's an important sort of thing to disentangle and to remember. Now, while the Klan were marginalized and in decline after that, they and other hate groups have undergone a revival recently, most notably the Klan, which everyone thought was sort of dead and gone. In fact, one of the revivals, and I don't want to make them more significant than they are still fringe players, but the fact that they're using Ferguson protests and Darren Wilson as causes to mobilize, to increase their presence on social media, etc., is quite significant. It's something a lot of academics and commentators have kind of gotten in, kind of acknowledged. Anti-racist activists coming up against the police and the Klan following racist violence, something that itself has brought back memories of civil rights. And the one thing many commentators say, whether it's Kimberly Crenshaw or Danny McLean, and I'll give the Danny McLean quote, "This moment has the potential to catapult change, just as a series of events that transpired 8 years after Emmett Till was killed did." And so it seems not a surprise to anyone that conservative media is trying to sort of, I guess, delegitimize those protests, and that's something that overlaps with what you said. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to introduce now Dr. Anne Daguerre, who is an Associate Professor of Work, Employment and Welfare in the Business School. Anne has just completed an ESRC mid-career fellowship looking at welfare reform in the US and the UK, and you're going to tell us about the US.
Today I'm going to focus on the economic, social, and historical background behind the protests, and especially the race riots. Well, it's not race riots, but And as Erin said, and also Remy has said, it's what we've seen in the past, over the past months, is part of a pattern of recurrent urban riots in the United States. So it must be understood in that context. And that takes place in the context of structural economic inequality and poverty of African Americans in particular. And it's really entrenched in American society, and despite the federal legislation that has been passed as part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and the affirmative actions, that hasn't been enough to actually counteract the deeply entrenched structural inequalities of the US society. And so it's always something that comes back to the surface and erupts and then goes down again. So there's a real cycle. So first, the Jim Crow laws. I just want to, by Jim Crow we mean a pattern of real and legal segregation. So legal segregation that was in the South after the Civil War, when the doctrine of separate but equal meant that African Americans were not allowed to sit in buses, not pattern of discrimination in schools. So the idea was that, yeah, separate but equal, a kind of apartheid in effect. And then that was in the southern states, but also in the northern states, especially industrial northern cities like Chicago, Baltimore, in fact, Pittsburgh, but Cleveland, some cities, some New York cities, Detroit. Blacks had moved in the 1920s, moved from the South in order to find jobs as part of the industry in the 1920s and 30s. And they had been, in the 1930s, excluded from US social policy, because Franklin Roosevelt had to get approval from the Southern Democrats to pass the federal, the New Deal legislation. And the New Deal legislation, especially unemployment insurance, excluded agricultural workers and domestic laborers because they didn't have enough unemployment insurance contributions to actually benefit from employment insurance. So there was a pattern of exclusion of blacks and Latinos, in fact, from US social policy, especially at the federal level. And then you had, as part of the federal, of the New Deal, a program called Aid to Dependent Children that provided for mothers single mothers with their children. And that, in fact, was originally aimed at widows, war widows. And the idea in the head of the legislators was that it was going to be aimed at war widows, respectable white middle-class women for the most part, to help raise their children. And then we have to go up until the 1950s, 1960s, there's a rediscovery in the early 60s of poverty in the United States. And the civil rights movement brings to the fore both the problem of the black urban ghetto as it emerges, and patterns of discrimination. So you have two pieces of legislation that are extremely important. One is the 1964 Economic Opportunity Act, which provides basically the idea that in order to improve the situation of inner cities, black ghettos as they were started to be identified by the Johnson administration, that you had to empower communities, and by that it was meant essentially black communities, to create jobs and to kind of self-manage themselves. And that was the community programs like Head Start, programs like Youth Corps, programs that were part of the war on poverty and the Great Society War on Poverty, and not to forget the 1963 March on Jobs for Jobs and Freedom. So it was that between 1963, 1964, early 1970s, that was a kind of golden age of anti-poverty initiatives in the United States. That was very short-lived. And as soon as it happened, though, there was an immediate backlash against it, almost as soon as it happened. The other important piece of legislation, of course, is the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But already southern states were complaining that it was putting too many restrictions on their freedom of basically states' rights, because the federal government introduced a lot of constraints, especially in terms of voting, to prevent constant discrimination against blacks in the southern states. And something called as voter suppression that was, anywhere we can discuss that, but that's also important. And also affirmative action legislation was introduced, which did benefit educated blacks, but left the urban poor behind. Then comes the 1970s and patterns of economic decline and deindustrialization, which affects primarily, again, African American communities at a time and then comes the 1980s that accelerates, and you have a scissors effect. You have deindustrialization on a massive scale in cities like Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and also some of them happening in the South, and cuts to the major anti-poverty programs in the 1960s implemented by the Reagan administration. And the massive cuts are to housing, and housing benefits African American communities and poor communities, but because of the over-representations. So that's one of the first casualties. And because of economic decline of inner cities, middle-class blacks migrate to white neighborhoods. So you have a declining fiscal source for urban neighborhoods, deprived urban neighborhoods, at a time when there are more and more problems. One problem, a big problem for African American communities, is the AIDS epidemic. It's still very important in the United States. There's patterns of deprivation that cities don't have the means to deal with. So, and what happens then with the Obama administration, over the Great Recession, it has accentuated. So the urban poverty that we have seen, that has actually been accentuated, and not only accentuated, but has spread. And that is one of the big legacies of the Great Recession. Before the Great Recession, the poor people, about 42 million in America, were already doing quite badly. But the very poor were doing even worse, because you have a pattern of extreme deprivation that has become worse. And African Americans have been stuck in terms, because the unemployment among blacks is twice as among whites. In certain cities like Chicago, for instance, for the unemployment rate of male teenagers is 92%. 92%. So there's absolutely no jobs, nothing to do, and because there's no opportunities, it's very, and cities don't have the resources, then there's a pattern of indeed criminality and informal secondary economy that develops as well. And also, to add to this, because when you have a conviction in the United States, it's extremely difficult to get back to the job market. So knowing that about 29% of black males born in 1991 are likely to be in prison, by the time they get out of prison, say in their early 20s, it's very difficult for them then to have a job. And the federal administration has tried to correct that to a certain extent. There's a lot of initiatives going on that try to address that, but it's a real difficulty, not to mention they don't have the right to vote as well in many states. So you have a pattern of exclusion that is being reproduced and accentuated, and it's almost like and in a context where even the American Recovery Act 2009, there had been some funding to anti-poverty programs such as welfare, housing, food stamps, and community service development blocks. But as soon as 2011, 2012, the investment has decreased tremendously. So it's back to where the way things were before, except that block grants have even declined. So you have, and it's not enough. So what's to be done? And then I stop. In 1992, when there was the LA riot, after the beating of Rodney King, when Rodney King, also an African American, was beaten violently by the police, and also found the police was very guilty. Then there was a riot erupted for days, and it was the most violent riot in US history, more violent even than the Washington riots in 1968 following the assassination of Martin Luther King. So it was huge. Anyway, Urban League then called for a Marshall Plan for the inner city. That proposal has never been implemented. And also, last thing is that we must also understand that it's no longer the inner city, it's also the suburbs that are have grown poor in the United States. Ferguson is a case in point. Ferguson is a suburban, 21,000 community. So it's actually, it's a suburb. So that means that you have along the inner cities, traditional pockets of urban deprivation in the United States, you have increasingly like a constellation of, not constellation, a kind of wide net of very fragmented suburbs which are disconnected from jobs as well. So and it makes also the mobilization of resources and political response quite difficult as well, because they're very fragmented and isolated in the landscape. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to bring in our Dean, Professor Joshua Castellino, for his comments on.
Thank you very much, Brad, and thank you for organizing this, Erin, and welcome, and thank you for attending. I just wanted to also pass on an apology from Kurt Barling, who was going to speak on this panel, but apparently he's got some less important event at some institution down the road called London School of Economics or something like that. Essentially, I think what I want to address my comments to is to look at the extent to which law has attempted to create a level playing field. About 9 months ago here at this institution, just in the quad, Jesse Jackson visited us, and one of the key things, one of his key messages was that essentially when the field is level, people perform equally. So the real challenge for people certainly working in the field of law has been to what extent can you create a level playing field. And I think the events of the last month or two have demonstrated to us a dramatic failure in that particular regard. And that is particularly hurtful because of the legacy that America gives us in terms of human rights and democracy. So we start off from the premise that we believe that the idea of democracy comes from the consent of the governed, and it's only the consent of the governed that makes a government legitimate. And then you look at that governed and you ask the question as to how much of them are consenting to creating a legal mechanism that keeps certain parts of society segregated. And for me, that particular challenge really can be addressed through law and should be addressed through law. We can't do much about the legacy of slavery, necessarily, but we can fix the consequences of it. And we can be determined to ensure that in our institutions and in the way in which we tackle various issues, we have not just the modicum of equality, but the real test of it. And what we are seeing is, once again, a failure to drive that equality agenda home. So 5 points I really want to make to you, and which demonstrate to me how much work still remains to be done with a view to getting anywhere near Martin Luther King's dream of 50 years ago. First of all, accountability. We have seen a dramatic failure of accountability in this particular instance. And accountability, I don't just mean of the police officer, I mean in the way in which some of the reporting has gone on, and Erin and Erin, you've talked about this in your presentations. I mean, Erin's focusing on extremism. For me, the worry is not the extremism, it's the mainstream. How far the mainstream is from really understanding what accountability truly means when violations occur. Violations will occur, there will always be extreme views there, there's little we can do about them. But when the mainstream population can't seem to address that particular question, then we have a real problem. Because the extremist views will exist, and in the American way of life, with the freedom of expression, those views should be countered by other views that are more informed. So the accountability issue is central for me, and it goes back even further. The extent to which we've really understood the legacy of the Jim Crow laws, the extent to which we've understood the legacy of slavery, and the extent to which we've understood the dispossession of indigenous Americans. And I think those aspects have not been high up enough in the agenda, except for token points in history when they're dramatically brought out. The second aspect really in terms of understanding how to tackle this inequality that we have that's ingrained are socioeconomic rights. And here we have a real problem in law. That essentially the frame of law that America pioneers, that essentially comes from Britain and the common law system, has been to believe in laissez-faire economics. That law will essentially provide protection to make sure that you can go about your daily lives in peace, obviously dramatic failures like the one in Ferguson, but by and large, we believe that law will provide the high points in society. Socioeconomic rights, well, that's your problem. That's down to your human enterprise. So that kind of narrative has allowed us to portray certain populations as saying, well, this is a land of plenty. You haven't been able to benefit. You are the ones who have failed to be entrepreneurs. Everybody else who's turned up from all these various countries, look at them. They're entrepreneurs. They've managed to accumulate capital. Why haven't you? And that's a failure of understanding the fact that if the playing field is uneven to start with, you're not going to generate enough wealth to be able to create the kinds of successes you want to. And some of the issues that Anne talked about with regards to contemporary employment there need to be borne in mind. So every time you have a push away from vulnerable groups, you will have a dramatic increase in inequality, an obvious factor, but building on a long-term legacy of inequality. The third element then, and this is where law has attempted to play some kind of role, is affirmative action. And affirmative action basically is an attempt to take a population that's vulnerable, that's somehow less empowered than the rest of society, to design mechanisms that are effective to bring them to a level playing field. Affirmative action measures have had a mixed reaction in the United States of America. Certainly in law schools it's a big issue now, because the argument is affirmative action measures go too far. If you want to test whether affirmative action measures go too far, simply look at GDP per head, educational attainments per head, life expectancy across the board, and look at that in racial terms. And then you can maybe start to ask that question about whether affirmative action measures have gone too far. Affirmative action measures may go too far, but essentially affirmative action measures are there to bring a population that's vulnerable up to the level of the median. We're nowhere near that. That tells me that we've designed our affirmative action measures poorly. That doesn't tell me affirmative action doesn't work. I think that debate is important to address head on if we're going to move forward in combating inequality. The fourth level up then from that is representation. And again, there have been many celebrations of Obama's presidency, but actually in terms of representation, there is still a major gap to be caught up with. And this is true, and I certainly read Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, not just in the context of black Americans, but in the context of vulnerable groups all over the world. And that for me has always been the challenge. If the rhetoric in our constitutions tell us we believe in effective equality, if we believe in the inherent dignity and worth, equal inherent dignity and worth of every individual, then we simply can't afford to tolerate inequality. And if we don't take those measures into account, and if we don't fight structures, institutional racism, by ensuring that they're more representative, we simply recreate the mistakes of the past. And this is what you see very classically in the US. You see that in terms of all the statistics you can look at. That essentially the society has not managed to correct the inequalities of the past because it's failed to get adequate representatives at various levels, not at the presidency maybe in this particular term, but at various levels across public administration, local administration, even university administration. There has been a failure to correct that question, that gap in representation. And the final element, I guess, that law can afford are specific elements of protection. And in the context of America, certainly one of the biggest issues, and Anne has touched on some of these issues, so I won't go over the welfare aspects, but hate speech has been one attempt to try and level that particular playing field. And I looked at some of the coverage that has been going on, and much of it borders very close to hate speech. The problem in the United States of America in context is that you have an absolute freedom of expression, but even that has come under attack. From the Village of Skokie case in 1973 through to a range of cases been taken by the Southern Poverty Law Center in Alabama, which are really trying to bankrupt organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and various other Aryan Nation and various other right-wing groups. But these measures have been few and far between. People talk about a drop in the ocean. Many of these things are not even drops in buckets. And that is the real challenge, the extent to which you can use law as a rapier thrust to address a wider issue of social injustice. So for me, those are the challenges that remain. And I think the big, and I finish on the point really that America is a beacon of democracy. America is a beacon of human rights. America is a beacon of value-led and value-driven politics. But it's only some people who benefit from that. And the extent to which that can be challenged, I think the proof of the pudding of the whole package will really determine in the extent to which that whole package is available to every individual in the United States, irrespective of any other discriminator, whether it's gender or race or ethnicity or religion.
Thank you, Joshua. So before we open this up, I'd like to pull together a few strands here. That we see clearly there are structural continuities. This question of legacy is something that is coming out in terms of both the perceptions and divisions within communities that themselves hold different views with respect to both their understanding of the specific incidents that have taken place over the last couple of months, but also broader understanding in terms of the accommodation of different groups, different racial communities within the United States. This idea that, well, haven't we moved beyond this? Can't we get over this? In this context, I'm reminded of a book I started reading, I should finish, this summer called How Children Succeed, which actually draws upon some recent theories that have been developed from behavioral economists and psychologists, which argue that even when you can control for poverty, for example, through affirmative action measures, if indeed you can, the fact that you have an unstable or destabilizing influence where you've had institutions that have been stripped away as a result of, for example, as Anne has suggested, a declining tax base, the failure to develop strong social institutions, changes in social organization and the like. It is precisely this highly conflicted context which actually gives rise to the sort of pressures which disable people, more so than identifying certain economic inputs. It's a much, much more complicated picture, and it's a picture which responds to these questions of legacy which have not been adequately addressed, either through policy or through discourse. And the fact that we're dealing with communities that are still segregated, whether it's on the basis of geography or on the basis of other forms of social interaction, raises further questions about the broader project from the last 50 years or so. So with that, I'd like to open up for questions. I hope you can still hear us, Remy?
I can you hear me?
So if you please like to introduce yourself if you have any questions and direct them to the specific members of the panel or the panel as a whole. Always good to start with no questions. Please.
Just like to ask you, you said, yes, America is a beacon of democracy, but I find it hard to take serious, actually, when just a month ago they had by-elections and only 1 in 3 voted, and how difficult it actually is an American vote, with voting fraud, with wiretapping, with like search and, what do you call it, search and risk, yeah, and all those examples just weigh up to me that democracy isn't a beacon in America, isn't valued. It's a country for the privileged few.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Now, obviously, the democracy is anything less than perfect, and hopefully you got that from what I was trying to say. But essentially, when you look at democracy as a game of numbers or a game of values, I think that becomes the challenge. And too often we focus on democracy as a game of numbers. So democracy by a game of numbers, you can simply eliminate the minority because you don't need to worry about them. And democracy as a game of values needs to be focused on much more. So when I say America is a beacon of democracy, I mean much more in terms of the historical legacy and in terms of its rhetoric and the extent to which that rhetoric has fed into trying to create a global human rights network. So you look at the extent to which global human rights, international human rights law has been framed, it's been framed very much on American values. You look at the extent to which global constitutions have been influenced, they've been influenced very much by American values. You look at quests for democracy globally, and they derive very much from some kind of aspiration for America. But what I was trying to say, tongue-in-cheek, was that this is the beacon of democracy we have, and this is the result we have, the kinds of events that have taken place, and that this needs to be challenged, and it needs to be challenged in a very, very, very dramatic way. I come from the world's largest democracy, and I can tell you it's no better at it. You know, we have a prime minister who should be a war criminal, should be indicted for war crimes against humanity. Again, his attitude, Narendra Modi of India, his attitude is, well, there was a riot that took place in 2002, and 3,480 people were killed, 3,478 just happened to be Muslim. That's not ethnic cleansing. So there are major problems with the extent to which the rhetoric of these democracies matches the practice. And for me, the ultimate test is, can you find a democracy where minority groups, i.e. groups in a vulnerable position, in a non-dominant position, whose ethnicity, language, religion might not coincide with that of the majority, can you find such countries that actually have equal rights for these individuals? That's the test. In America, the answer is on paper, yes, in practice, no.
Maria Jones, I've got a question for Remy. You talked about...
Can you hear Remy?
I can. Not great, but I can.
Remy, you talked about the white feeling being that in America that we should move on from this. To what extent, over here in the UK, reporting on these issues are pretty much tapering out and dying down. So to what extent on the ground in the States is this still an issue that is very much alive, if at all?
So if I'm hearing your question correctly, you're referencing my comments that a lot of the white community doesn't wants to just move on, and you're asking to what extent here in St. Louis is this still a live issue?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's it.
I think it depends on where you live. If you live in North St. Louis, which is the heavily African-American part of St. Louis, this is still very much an issue that is of daily, even hourly concern. If you live in South St. Louis in the city, it's a nuisance that you have to be reminded of, possibly on a daily, but maybe only on a weekly basis. The neighborhood that I live in still has boarded up shop windows from the night after the...
Oh, you frozen.
On screen? Remy.
Joshua, just to pick up on the first of your 5 points, accountability, which I found hugely important and challenging. How do we work towards getting more of this when there's over and over cases like this where these police officers are not being called before or not being indicted? We had Jumi Mbenga, who was deported from Britain back to Angola, who was restrained on an aircraft by these private G4S officers who were cleared yesterday of his murder by a jury. So there's many stories of these emerging, and over these people get cleared, and it's where do we move? How can we move in this area?
I think it's working on accountability is the most frustrating thing at the moment, because you don't seem to have accountability at so many different levels. I mean, today is the Al-Swedi inquiry of British atrocities into Iraq, and again, the Ministry of Defence will be given a clean sheet. We know that already, despite the evidence that's mounting in terms of many of the atrocities committed. And accountability is becoming one of those things that accountability disconnected from power is the way in which you try and tackle this issue, because at the moment, accountability and power seem to go hand in hand. Yet accountability in theory is meant to be an attempt to make everybody accountable. And it fundamentally goes against the rule of law to be able to see that some people who are powerful can get away with it. At the moment, in international legal terms, one of the biggest challenges, of course, is that the International Criminal Court that's been created is going after petty African dictators and is not addressing the major issues across the world. And this is undermining any attempt to build a human rights community. Where do we go from it? It seems that essentially the mainstream communities are not interested in accountability. It seems that we're not educating people enough to be able to ask those kinds of questions. And we just don't seem to get those kinds of stories into the mainstream press. And it's odd to me, because as a former journalist, I would say there's a real value in these kinds of stories that aren't being picked up. And being able to try and I think creating that kind of momentum in the public space is crucial. Because if the public understand that accountability means accountability of everybody, then of course you have a Tahrir Square type movement, where you basically say, I'm sorry, Mubarak no more, rule of law for everyone. But we haven't created that, and this is probably I guess the crisis of social democracy at the moment, in that we have not addressed accountability, and that goes for the individual violation, like Brown, like Eric Garner, but it goes also for state accountability, and the extent to which the powerful get away with it. We have given up the idea that Tony Blair could ever be accountable for crimes in Iraq. We have rewarded him with the title of Peace Envoy. That's been given up. So there are lots of ghosts that have simply been given up. We have given up the idea that actually, in terms of the financial crisis, taxing the top 1% is part of the answer. We've given up some obvious answers. And the reason we've had to give these up is because the public space hasn't been mobilized enough to focus on these kinds of questions of accountability.
Okay, we've got another question. Can I take this question, then we can come back to you, Remy? It may indeed be addressed to you. Please.
Yeah, this is particularly for Joshua, but I guess it's addressed to everyone. So, based on your response, do you think the answer lies more in reforming our values?
Could you speak up, please?
do you think the answer lies more in reforming our value system? Because I think someone mentioned about how conservative media is being presenting this, but I think like liberal media is to a degree as complicit as well, because you get this kind of over reporting of someone talking lightly about Obamacare or certain measures, as opposed to other ones like you said, taxing the top rich, or like trying to instill the understanding that Tony Blair is just as guilty as someone in what's happening with Israel and Palestine now and the attacks, and or wherever in Africa with, let's say, the campaigns of what's his name, the Coney 2012 campaigns and things like that. So is it more to do with the fact that even with international war criminals, we still categorize people who are a bit browner as the baddies, and people like Tony Blair and George Bush and even Obama to a degree, because people argue that because of his background, he came from a biracial family, that maybe, again, like the point about affirmative action, I think that you said, then you touched on that is supposed to do with certain blacks that get higher, as opposed to, you know, trying to indiscriminately judge everyone.
I think it's a really good question. I just focus on the media issue, and if I could connect it to the comment about extremism. One of the things is that while the sort of, let's call them the more extreme, I would sort of dispute that definition, but or the description. While they kind of say somewhat outlandish things, they're still trying to neutralize it. They're still trying to make it about the individual, or the protesters, or things like, or you know, good cops, bad apples, things like that. But the liberal media has its own neutralizing tactics. The word racial divide, or race relations, or teachable moment, or let's discuss and learn, or let's reform. These are all neutralizing tactics. The problem we have, I think, with the extremism thing is that, I mean, my argument was sort of 3 points. One is, the extremists were not always extreme. They became extremists when the mainstream changed. Yeah. And the mainstream changed around a post-civil rights consensus in which we've gone this far, we don't have to talk about it anymore. And then what the people who used to be sort of these foot soldiers of segregation became the extremists, Aryan nations, paramilitary clans, and this is why the Southern Poverty Law Center could fight them. They couldn't fight the Klan when they were the Klan. No, exactly. And what's happened, I think, with the conservative media is that the mainstream has both been moved on the right, more extreme, and the mainstream has been neutralized by the extremist discourse on one side, but also the fact that you're protecting the status quo, and I think that's a lot of what you were talking about the accountability and stuff like that. So we rubber stamp things. So I think in a sense we've got a lot of people talking, and I'm not sure I'm even hoping for reform or progress or anything like that. There has to be a recognition of these type of contradictions, these type of power dynamics, and as long as we have the ideological noise. I don't think anything's going to get done. As long as we have the ideological noise on one side and the complete power imbalance on the other. But I think your point about liberal media was really right on. I'm not sure I answered your question.
I think my answer to that would be very similar, and I think the biggest challenge has been the extent to which the room for dissent has closed down. And there are plenty of examples, plenty of excuses for that. Oh, because you might be a terrorist. Oh, because we don't know if there's a threat out there. Whether it's crime, whether it's surveillance, there is very, very little room for dissent. And actually, you can probably measure the robustness of a democracy by how much room there is for dissent. And if you use that measure, especially since September 11th, almost all democracies will fail. Because the room has cut down. And oddly enough, I did this comparison a while ago because I was comparing India and China in the context of some rights in terms of minorities. India and China, one a democracy, if you read the press. The other, a totally repressive, maniacal regime, if you read the press. And again, when you look at the room for dissent, actually the room for dissent is exactly the same. So that the room for dissent has been gradually closing. The public space is restricted, so only specialists can occupy the public space. The vast majority of people don't have a say. Paradoxically, of course, you have social media. So paradoxically, everybody has a say. But everybody's speaking and nobody's listening. So the room for dissent has been completely cut down. And if you say something that's slightly untoward, you can be done for it. There's a range of terrorist laws, anti-terrorist laws, in every regime now that actually look very much like the US Patriot Act. And they are across the board, across the 194 countries that make up the UN.
I think the dissent issue is really important. One of the things is America has a two-party system. They've constructed a false polarization, and that's all the dissent that's allowed. That kind of
organized dissent.
Absolutely.
Sorry, we've got a question from
Yeah.
No, I was saying when we go back to voice
okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Hold on one moment. Then. Remy, can we just come back to you?
Sure.
You were midway.
And I think that the initial question was about sort of local response, and I had a much more long-winded question, but so I don't get cut off again. I think what it boils down to is an idea of what often gets talked about with white privilege. For some people in St. Louis, they have the privilege, in this case, the privilege that comes from being white, of not having to talk about these issues, of being able to ignore them, being able to say, this doesn't affect me, I don't care, I don't want to talk about this anymore, for which they see the ongoing issues of Ferguson as an inconvenience at worst, but not really something they need to deal with. Whereas for the African-American residents of St. Louis, this is very much an issue of life and death, of their civil rights, of the fundamental issues of democracy that have been discussed by some of the other panelists today.
Thank you.
So that's the short version.
Okay. Let me bring in our colleague.
Yeah, question for Remy, and a question for you, for Remy. And it's about this protest movement, because I think this should be, I mean, the riots or urban revolts, as I prefer to call these events. Can you
look this way?
All right, yeah, sorry. I was wondering if you can see, or these events can be seen, can be framed as a kind of, not saying maybe it's a wrong word, a kind of continuation of the Occupy movement, or if you can see links in the demands of the Occupy movement, you know, Occupy Wall Street and Oakland and so on, and the current protest. And yeah, that's it. Yeah, some comments left.
Right, so yeah, asking if there's connections to kind of Occupy or other wider movements, is that correct?
Yeah.
No. The plain answer is no. Occupy, particularly here in St. Louis, has been a defunct movement for several years now. Now, I know there are some linkages in New York, in that they share some activists, but issues of wider social justice have been slow in developing here in terms of the coalitions due to a variety of factors, including several national level civil rights movements, most notably the NAACP and Al Sharpton's organization coming in and attempting to co-opt some of the protest movements here in a way that local African-American activists have resented. So there's a wariness on the part of local activists to ally now with outside movements. In fact, there's been a lot of discussion about their place in a wider discussion, in the national discussion, and they feel that they're often sort of pushed to the back of that discussion, particularly amongst younger activists here who are, I would say, resentful almost of the framing of what's gone on in Ferguson as a continuation of the Black Civil Rights Movement of 1960 and the invocation of certain elements of that movement, particularly the involvement of Black churches, as vital for the civil rights struggle of this nature. They push back on that very, very hard. And I've actually seen during the protests, younger activists getting into arguments in the midst of marches, in the midst of vigils, with older African American activists that come from the church about who has the vision of the movement and who shapes the movement and who speaks for the movement. And you did see some white sort of social justice activists that were present in the early days in particular, but it was made very clear to the majority of them that this was not a movement where their leadership was desired, that this was more seen as an issue of race, and that those issues needed to be worked out first and foremost before we got to other underlying issues of economic justice.
Thank you. We've got a comment here from Erin.
I think that's one of the things that I was really struck by, having lived in the UK for almost 13 years, that the absence of actually any wider discussions around more structural inequalities, that it almost becomes reduced to a question about race, which I'm not suggesting isn't relevant or isn't important, but actually, if, you know, the reason that Anne is here particularly to talk about welfare is because there's a link between race and poverty. And I'm not suggesting that this particular movement should include social justice activists particularly, but for me there does seem to be an absence of discussion across different media sources about class in this and about more structural inequalities that have to do with poverty. And I guess it's just a comment, really.
I think there's more discussion is going to be about when you talk about particularly zero tolerance policing and broken windows. And I think a lot of people have commented, and I think it's sort of peripheral to the main discussion, but that actually the reason these problem areas were always not only racialized but classed, except the identification of the criminal was always racialized. And I think that's where you see things intersect. But I think it's mostly in sort of, I guess, criminology and sort of people who are discussing the policing issue.
I just want to react to what Joshua said. There's this idea that in the United States, if you don't, because other communities, especially immigrant communities, Latinos are not doing that well. There's an interesting phenomenon in the US between the second, third generation of African Americans, so the descendants of slaves, basically, that's what it is, as opposed to the immigrants from Africa and West Africa. And there is a divide, and that was at play in the election of Obama. Obama at first was a bit criticized for not being black enough and not representing the experience of African Americans. And then African American, and it was called Bounty, I think. Bounty, like not
black inside and white inside. Yeah.
That's right.
You need some for all black people.
So no, but and there's in Washington D.C. Newcomers, the new generation of of Africans coming in the country actually sometimes seems to be doing better than African Americans, and that is a puzzle. Why it is, and that's also something that we see, and that's a recurrent discussion in the UK. Why do perform less well? And I think that has to do with entrenched inequality and a kind of, well, I would say a memory of oppression that kind of has long-lasting effects and impact. And kind of perpetuate themselves. And that is also why perhaps the post-racial consensus can feel so good at first, because that's a good way of healing things, like calming things down, enough of all this hate and rape, and this racial hatred. Let's come to nice agreement. And the Obama election would seem to represent that. And Obama also has been criticized for not stepping in defense of his brothers, so to speak. But he has also been criticized and he has been extremely careful not to do that, because as soon as he opened his mouth, the right wing criticizing him for being then partial for in having a bias in favor of African Americans. So it's almost as if Obama has been even more cautious than, say, Clinton. Clinton was adored by African Americans. So there are complex dynamics.
Indeed.
I got a question.
I've got two questions. I'd like to come back to Remy. Please, can you speak up?
Is it any interest, far from the general public in America, to, especially from the institutional governments, to do something in order to tackle this type of racism in America? The racism, for example, the police, about working with a white and a black police. There is any type of plans in order to make changes, in order to avoid more of these types of racism?
I couldn't catch that. Sorry, could you repeat it, or Brad, could you?
It was a question really about what sort of anti-racist strategies are there that can be directed at the police in particular.
Well, I teach the Sydney police officers. We actually teach a lot of the officers that work for the city that want to make rank. And this has been something we've been discussing in our criminology theory class this semester with about 30 of the officers. And there's trainings they go through. The difficulty isn't a lack of training on these issues, I think. It's a lack of understanding or a lack of will on the part of a large swath of the American police force that these are even issues. There's a fundamental lack of understanding of sort of the structural factors that have been discussed this afternoon, as well as cultural factors and the role that their sort of cultural biases may play in the way that they conduct policing. We had a very extended argument about racial profiling, and at the end of the day, I'd say several of them sort of were willing to consider that there may be bias, but the vast majority of the officers that I was engaged with refused to believe that profiling didn't work, and refused to believe that you know, even the statistical evidence that we were presenting was legitimate. It was, you know, there's a distrust of government by police who are governed themselves, part of the government, but there's a distrust of the Justice Department. There's a distrust of state and federal structures that are meant to deal with accountability issues. And there's just a overall an attitude that, and I think some of the panelists have referenced sort of the war on terror and its corroding effects it's had on democracy, that they are imbued with a certain authority as police officers, and that for anyone to question that authority necessarily puts them in the realm of suspicion, so that when there is a discussion that an entire racial or ethnic group is getting bad treatment, the problem isn't the treatment that group is receiving, but that group itself for making that claim. So sorry to be pessimistic there, but I think it's a long road ahead for any sort of meaningful reform to occur here.
Thank you. We have one other question here. Yes.
It's more a comment than a question, but if anyone wants to elaborate, you know, why not? It's more going back to Nicola's question about the Wall Street movement, and I was listening to a discussion made by Slavoj Zizek, and he was talking about the Wall Street movement back then, and I think you can draw a parallel between that movement and the rise in Ferguson and around the world, basically, on how he said the best thing that could happen to the Wall Street movement is that it got broken down and dispersed by the police, because then the idea keeps going, but you don't need to put in the effort of actually writing. So, you know, you can draw that parallel, you know.
I just like.
So, Marion, would you like to follow up on that point?
Well, no, I was going to ask something slightly different.
Okay, can you hold that thought for a second? Do you have any comments on that as a sociologist on Slavoj Žižek's idea here that the idea will linger more than the actual movement?
I think there's some truth to that in the sense that social movement scholars like Rebecca Klatch and Catherine Corville Brown have certainly looked at the long-term biographical effects movement activity has in keeping people engaged. But I think, I'd push back on that a little bit and say that in terms of that we wanted to have sort of a more meaningful outcome in actually influencing American society in American structural sort of inequalities, the comparison that would have been best would have been the Tea Party movement, which despite, how people may feel about it individually, has remained influential and a force that does have an active shaping on American politics, and some of the things that have been brought up by other panelists, and some of the more reactionary elements and the revival or the reinfusion of some of the more conservative groups in America.
Okay, we have
Yeah, just a quick comment on that. I think it depends is the answer. I mean, as a lawyer, I probably use that phrase most often. But in a sense, when you look at the way in which the occupation movement around the world was dispersed, it was pretty effective. In that by dispersing it, you didn't just get rid of the crowd in front of St. Paul's, you got rid of the issue from the mainstream imagination. So I'm not sure I agree with that thesis at all. That you need almost a dramatic Tiananmen Square type man crushed under a tank image for that drama to linger. But actually what it has done is the dispersal has been totally effective. From the perspective of the state now in Britain, you don't even need to worry about protesters because police powers include kettling, which means that 3 kilometers before the protest zone, before the protest site, you've already cordoned off people in such a way that they don't get to the site. So you actually, for me, it's the issue of the space for dissent. And in that case, it's the physical space for dissent. But the space for dissent in all kinds of ways are closing down. And I'm not sure that I would love to read Žižek in a way that there's hope here, the movement lingers. I think people have forgotten about it. And I think, how many massacres will it take in the States to highlight that guns in schools are not a good idea? How many individuals will be beaten up by the police before we find out that maybe the police overreact in certain circumstances? I'm not sure the memory aspect really works here.
I think what we heard today suggests it doesn't. So can I bring in Marion and then you?
Yeah, I'm Marion McGowan and I work in the business school and my interests include business human rights, and thank you for a wonderful event. I wish it was in the town hall or in somewhere public where that space that we're talking about that's contracting so dramatically could start to open up. Accountability, I believe that empowerment is a function of accountability. And my question is, because it is really rather depressing, this scenario. I mean, if you look at current elections in Africa today, and I'm following particularly Zambia, and there is some disempowerment among the mainstream. I mean, if you read the media, the blogging stuff, the predictability of factors is just clear. So my question is, to the panel, is that I believe mainstream is confused because they're not sure what intervention, what's going to be the catalyst. Is it through education? Is it through the economic intervention? Is it, Joshua's explained that law and economics do work together, obviously. But where do you see the fastest route to the empowerment and the articulation in some more effective way than we're currently able to foresee or that we can come to grips with?
Did you get that, Remy?
Yeah, what's the solution?
Well, there's a question to the panel, which was really about how to empower. How to empower. We've got Erin.
Can I respond rather more pessimistically again? I mean, I think the point that I tried to make with my presentation was that actually, you know, we've seen these issues time and time again, and there's very little change actually. The representation of African Americans as criminal, as white and blacks in a kind of race relations sort of divide, I think positions the kind of the African American other in a place where actually there's very little talk about empowerment, there's very little talk about education, there's very little talk about poverty in terms of actually creating real systematic change. It's so much easier to focus on, well, Michael Brown was, you know, he stole some cigars, and so to a certain extent he almost deserved this. And look at the African Americans in Ferguson, they're rioting, they're burning, they're looting. They deserve any kind of response that they get. I think there's very little discourse around what systematically can be done to empower or to change the situation, which for me is incredibly frustrating and hugely problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what the mainstream can do or whatnot, I mean, I think the problem is you've got a lot of competing interests, sort of ideological stratification. I mean, you look, and I just want to, I mean, look at this country, for example. I mean, I read an article the other day that says how Britain avoided a Ferguson-like situation. Didn't mention Duggan-like situation or the recent another man who couldn't breathe. Or the fact that there's a complete consensus that immigrants and benefit scroungers are the problem. The fact is that, like, I mean, I have no hope at all. Because actually we're always scapegoating, reifying, ideologically misrecognizing things, and it maintains a complete status quo. Where, again, the people who think the protest that's actually legitimate is the kind of crazy talk radio pundit talk. Or, you know, the idea that we have, like, you know, Nigel Farage is a sort of vanguard of democracy because he's like, he speaks the truth, the same truth that the other parties are now copying. And, you know, I mean, I think it's I say confused, it's quite clear what's going on, but it's actually, you can't have a discussion about this. You're already pitted against each other, talking at cross purposes, misrecognizing things, and until the power structure and the way it operates is clearly identified, becomes transparent, that it can't be denied. And again, I would go back to the police thing. I think cultural sensitivity is the wrong way to do it. It's the thing that makes conservatives laugh. It's the thing that treats it as if it's something other than it is. They need a sociological analysis. They need to know that their interests are similar to the poor and disenfranchised that they are pitted against often. And I think until those structures become transparent, there's very little hope.
Well, I disagree, actually. I mean, I think, in a sense, I've tried the emphasis in your question, what is the fast way? There isn't a fast way. So in that sense, I share the pessimism. But I think there are other ways. I initially thought the way to do this is tell the whole world, they will know about it. So I worked as a journalist, and actually, the whole world wasn't that interested. Then I thought, okay, so what is the issue here? Essentially, the Constitution is promising equality. People aren't being equal, yet it's not an issue. So clearly, we can take them to court. So sue the lot of them. You know, nail the bastards, if you like, in legal language. In the best legal language that judges understand. That didn't work, because actually the structure of law is such that it's only the powerful who get access to the law. So then you think, well, so there's no shortcut solution, really. There are some attempts at getting a shortcut solution. So you get the high-profile case, which makes the headline. That's about 1 in 500. But that's fine, that's still something. If it's significant enough, it can make a difference. So then you have the slow routes available, which is education. And that, in a sense, is a frustrating route, because you think, well, how long? And what about this generation? And what about this generation's children? Why should they have to do it? But actually, I think taking these kinds of ideas, changing curricula to be about stuff that's relevant, as opposed to stuff that's not relevant. And for me, and I didn't study in this jurisdiction, I studied completely outside this jurisdiction. I can see the value of philosophy totally. I like reading it. But insisting a law student go out with philosophy more than understanding what inequality is, I disagree. I think we've got to send people out with the kinds of ideas of what world they operate in. Instead, we have a received wisdom of what is education, which essentially means 10 people speaking to each other in code, and everybody else understanding it. So for me, that has become the quest. Education, changing education, what education is, changing who avails of it, changing to what impact they're going to use it. That is part of the quest. But no, it's not going to give you a short answer. It's not going to give you a fast solution. But if you can ask the right questions, and if you can challenge power without fear and with authority, you will get somewhere. Will you get there quick enough? The answer is certainly not. But will you get there eventually? I think it will. And certainly in the world that I work in, with judges across, so I do lots of work with judiciaries across the world, do lots of work with advocates across the world. You know, advocates are waking up on a daily basis, NGO activists are waking up on a daily basis, and they're out there fighting for rights. Who are we to be pessimistic? I don't feel I have the right to be pessimistic. My life is not at stake. These people are putting their lives at stake on a daily basis. They're failing to feed their families effectively because of what they believe in. I don't think we have the right to be pessimistic. So.
And do you want to comment on that before I bring in Remy?
Sure. In terms of sort of a singular solution, sorry, am I interrupting somebody?
No, go on, please.
Sorry about that. I think I'm on a bit of a lag. I was going to say that for majority of Americans, I think what they've decided on as the solution is badge cameras. That if we just use technology and make the police.
Or we're actually not making it illegal to actually film in the first place.
Yes, let's take your question.
So you kind of answers was when I asked my question, but in terms of education, again,
no question is educated, that's not
That's true.
Yeah,
yeah. I don't believe in this linear development evolution, which will take us more, to a proper democracy. I don't really believe in that. I believe in ruptures and,
Yeah, but my point was going to be that maybe that's the point, the understanding that certain people are going to excel, and whether it's Nigel Farage or whichever politician, or someone not. Because let's say we're talking about stuff like Black History Month or whatever in school. It's just the fact that we still have it. It's not like part of the mainstream narrative. As I think Joshua mentioned, and I think you mentioned as well. And even it can be connected to like other issues, whether it's all about women and accountability for rape, and the understanding that we don't empower them by making them identify with something else apart from what they see on TV or whatever. So I feel like we, again, coming back to what you said, we keep coming back to certain blocked wall, whereas because we only see so much, so I guess when, based on your point about there's no space for dissent, when we're questioning it, instead of like honestly critiquing it, we just immediately, even if we do think that Nigel Farage is a racist or this person's a bit stupid or this person's smart, we don't like critically question it. I think. Do you think that's the problem more so? Is not just the fact that we just label people certain things.
But I think, as Joshua said, look, protest in this country is a crime. I'm very radical in this, and I've seen it happening over the last 25 years. Slowly, they don't even allow you to go to a demonstration, as you said. If you were in a Pacific demonstration in Westfield, was it the other day? They arrested 33 people. Totally peaceful, sort of Gandhian people. That's what you're talking about. It's the panpsychology should be problem for you. If you're not like them, you are something else. You're a barbarian. How can you complain about the best possible system in the world? This is the idea.
That's why.
What would you do if you were in Afghanistan? This is the idea. The superiority of the system shows in every aspect, in every pause of that expression. They have. This is again.
Yeah, that's what I mean by my point. Like,
no, I swear to you.
Yeah.
A number of people who want to speak. I think.
My question is for her, and this goes back to empowerment and history, the oppression. What can the government do to help? Like what you said, it goes all the way to history and how the people are the descendants of the slaves today, and so they might not do as well as maybe other people, other minorities who have come from Africa and other places. How can the government help to stop that, you know, the reoccurring, you know, issues, you know, with the African Americans, the crime, and because everything has just been an issue, you know, from the past. So, you know, the poverty has come from the past, you know, the being criminals and all of that, it has all come from the past. So how can the government help? How can they empower? Apart from education, you know, as been said, it's slow.
Well,
education is good.
There's no problem. There's nothing quick. But because to bring back jobs and opportunities, and so that people can take advantage of new jobs and opportunities, that's going to take a lot of time, and we're talking about reversing, in some cases, decades of chronic underinvestment in public services and repairing trust in public services, in the justice system, in the police, and all of that takes a lot of time. However, in terms of quick answers, there's one thing, and that is not necessarily very popular. But to get back to the message of Kennedy, you know, ask yourself what you can do for your country and your community, as opposed to what my country can do for me. And so instead of always expecting responses from the state, get back to the so-called roots of the problem of the community and ask the community what can they do from themselves, and so that and recreate a sense of hope and space, so that there's something, and equally also perhaps a little bit of tough responses, you know, because there's no denying that there is a problem of criminality and drug trafficking, and for all structural economic responses. I mean, I used to be very anti-cultural explanation of poverty, and I am. But if you're not clear about, well, certain behaviors and petty criminality are not going to be tolerated because that puts a stain on us, then you're not going to get any traction. So I think it also starts with, you know, people taking their destiny again in their own hands.
Erin wanted to follow up.
Could I just follow that up, if that's okay? To connect it back to the Zizek Occupy thing, the one thing I would see that connects Occupy in this movement, and actually the 2011 sort of riots, is the fact that these are occurring in the wake of a economic crisis that's disproportionately affected poor Black and minority ethnic peoples. The fact is that the one time where the government not only may not be able to, but is absolutely unwilling to help, to resource, to support, is when they're doing nothing but cuts. And my problem with the Kennedy campaign is, imagine David Cameron saying that. Don't ask what we can do for you, ask what you can do for us. That's saying get off benefits and get a job in your post-industrial waste society.
That's not what I meant.
No, but what I'm saying is that in a neoliberal, free market, anti-welfare state context, that's what that statement can only be articulated as by a politician. And so what I think what's going on here, now this is again going back to the class issue, and I should say I know people I'm bringing Britain in because I'm American, I'm Canadian, but I thought we were the beacon of democracy. But yeah, so the fact is that there is either what is claimed to be an inability to resource these things, or an unwillingness. I would argue it's the latter. And so it's saying, do for yourself in your post-industrial wasteland.
No, that's true, but that's true, but you still have a problem of credibility for when you all have a problem of credibility when we preach something and we do the exact opposite. And that is not, and you have to be, and I think you have to be, we have to learn to be consistent. So, for instance, I mean, that's as a political activist, if I saw somebody in my community as a leftist say, doing exactly the opposite of what they say or preach, well, I should be on their case. It's not because it's part of my lefty tribe that I'm not going to say, well, hang on a second, you shouldn't be doing this. It's the exact opposite of what we've been saying all along. And that's where, you know, that used to be, so, and we can, that's, of course, in the context of declining resources, you know, how can you, I'm not talking about organizers teaching and distributing wholesalers, and, you know, you all have to do that. And, you know,
do you mean you don't do any drugs if you want us to help you and support you? Is that what you mean?
Well,
drugs are actually one of the last things they have in their life, I would say.
Should we, I think we probably need to wrap up. Should we continue the conversation? Which is where all the law students are, not that I'm over here particularly.
So we have an invitation now to...
extended from Laurent as like the...
oh, I see, extended from our head of department.
Don't do any drugs anymore.
To carry on the discussion about climate. I think we've had a wonderful discussion. Many ideas have been generated. Some pessimistic assessments, some optimistic assessments. I'm sorry that Remy can't be brought in for just a final word from the field, from the front line, so to speak. But thank you all for your participation, and Erin, thank you for organizing this.